This is the Everything 80s Podcast, Episode 7, the best breakfast cereals of the 1980s. Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s Podcast, brought to you by everything80spodcast.com. I'm Jamie, and today we're looking at the greatest substance known to a child during the 1980s, and those are the iconic breakfast cereals that were out at that time, and the golden age of cereal. And I'm going to look back at some specific ones, ones you might not remember. We'll play a little bit of the commercials for them, see if you recognize some of the old time promotions for them, everything like that. But before we get started, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on YouTube, you can subscribe there, or there's a link down below, all that good stuff. Okay, let's get right into this. Okay, do you remember being a kid and being in the grocery store with your parents or whoever and just like pleading for your dream breakfast cereal, like your life depended on it? That was me pretty much. It's just the 80s really ushered in this whole new era of products that were really highly desired by kids. It was a time of deregulation, which I'll cover in a minute, which would basically there was a lot of restrictions on what could be advertised and pushed to kids. And in the 80s, all that went out through the window. So that's why you see this like onslaught of new products and cartoon shows and toys and junk food and all that sort of stuff. So you see a real explosion of cereal varieties and characters and tons of great advertising campaigns that made these breakfast cereals honestly as coveted as a lot of toys. They were presented in a cartoon fashion. So I don't know if you grew up like me, but we were not allowed sugary junk cereal. This was the biggest treat in the world. That anything that came in a brightly colored box with some sort of cartoon on it was not going to be making it into my bowl. And as a kid, this is the most devastating thing that can probably happen. So if you're like me, we were raised on Cheerios, Corn Flakes, Weetabix. If we were lucky, Honey Nut Cheerios. That was about as extravagant as our cereal options got. And a lot of the things I'm seeing in commercials in the grocery stores, which could not even really be considered foods, but I mean, that just makes a kid want them more and more. They're like facsimile foods but you didn't care. You just wanted these things more than life itself. Specifically to me, seeing Cookie Crisp commercials when I was younger was borderline abuse, knowing first I was never going to get to have cookies for breakfast. That is a child utopia to have cookies for breakfast. But the other thing is it wasn't available in Canada where I'm from. We'd see the American commercials, so even if I was going to get it, there wasn't any shot. One huge thing would happen in the summer. Sometimes we'd head north to a cabin and all our family would be there, aunts, uncles, everything like that, and my aunts and uncles would be in charge of the food. And I remember almost passing out when I saw a box of Trix and Fruity Pebbles on the countertop. So like for a little kid, that's just a dream come true. So the problem for these brands was that they're 100% targeted to kids, and they really have no hope of cornering the adult market, unless you're like a high college student. So the top selling breakfast cereals of all time have generally been things like Honey Nut Cheerios, Frosted Flakes, Honey Bunches of Oats is up there, regular Cheerios, Special K, Mini Wheats, Cinnamon Toast Crunch gets in there. That's a big one. But it's generally, this is a very, not a small market, but a more isolated market. So when you're promoting to kids, you cut out a lot of those adults. So this goes back into what is called, this is a very real effect, and it's called pester power. And it's the effect of a kid begging and pleading from anything from a cereal like this to a toy to going to Chuck E. Cheese for dinner, whatever. It's actually a very successful thing. And as much as parents don't want to admit it, they at many times have given into the demands of whining children just to shut them up, and children determine a huge part of a family's spending, most notably areas being where the family's going to eat, where they're going to go on vacation, which blows my mind. I have all these stats linked up that I've researched. So if you want to see what I call the show notes today, so that's the entire blog, the whole written format of this thing. It's got more pictures and videos, and you can see that by going to everything80spodcast.com/7. If you're listening on YouTube, the link will be down below to go see this all written out. But it's basically kids determine so much more in a family's spending than a family actually realizes or wants to admit. So manufacturers are aware of this, and they aim to direct advertising to children as they know they're the ones that are going to influence a lot of the family's purchases. McDonald's being a huge one, they spend more money advertising the Happy Meal than they do on adolescents and adults, and because it works. Go back, I have a whole episode on the history of the Happy Meal, which is pretty crazy itself. So cereal companies and many other manufacturers, especially in the 80s, started getting big on using cartoon animals in their products. And up to that point, you were only allowed to have, I think it was 7 seconds of cartoon, because kids cannot differentiate between what's an advertisement and what's a cartoon. So they were supposed to limit the amount of cartoon. And like I said, in the 80s with this deregulation, that's all out the window. So these kids' cereal commercials are basically full-on cartoons, and they would use animals due to the effect. It's called anthropomorphism. And this is when animals, especially cute, cartoony ones, take on human traits. And this really draws in children, and it creates a strong association with the character and ultimately to that product, because the kid doesn't know necessarily they're watching the Honey Smacks frog or whoever that was. They just see it as something they're drawn into and connecting with from this little cartoon world. So the advertising along with the manufacturing goes, even farther than this. If next time you're in a grocery store, check out the cereal aisle. All the kid-friendly cereals are all lower down, right at a kid's eye level. And you may notice that on the floor, sometimes in front of these cereals are, there's like colorful designs or creations on the floor. You might see some form of hopscotch, something like interactive. You can probably picture what I'm saying. This is to slow you down, especially your kids, and allows them to be exposed to all these cereals. Some grocery stores would use long runner mats as they, like carpeting base all the way through, as they tend to slow down the shopping cart. And, the pushing and what you're slowing down, it leads you to more time exposed to the products. And in any form of retail, the simplest rules, the longer a person stays in the store, the more money they will spend. And these companies know how to get a kid's attention with that very real effect of what they call pester power. And, it means there's a good chance that cereal with the frog is going to go home with you because the kid's screaming for it. Okay, so I don't know, hopefully you find that interesting. So with that out of the way, we're going to look back on 10 or so of what I think are some of the most iconic and synonymous cereals of the 1980s. And the first one we're going to start with are the monster cereals. And that would be, Count Chocula, Frankenberry, Boo Berry, but let's listen to them.
Frankenberry cereal is coming your way. How about a monster for breakfast today?
Want a hanky, Frankie?
Thanks. And how about some wonderful Frankenberry cereal with oodles and oodles, a strawberry-flavored marshmallows. And Frankenberry is part of this good, nutritious breakfast. Here comes Count Chocula. Wish you could stay. How about a monster for breakfast today?
Okay, jumping right in with these ones. These monster cereals are probably my favorites, and actually kind of interesting with the story. So, I mentioned Count Chocula, Frankenberry, my personal favorite, Boo Berry. But did you know there's actually a few more that rounded out the whole monster cereal collection? So the monster cereals first started in early 1971 with Count Chocula, whose official name was Count Alfred Chocula, and then the strawberry-flavored Frankenberry. And the idea is that they would base these cereals on cartoon versions of classic movie monsters. Depending how old you are, if you might remember, Frankenberry ran into some problems in the early 70s when some of the pigment used to turn the cereal pink was basically causing kids to crap out pink as well, too. Boo Berry was introduced in the mid 70s, and that helped to swing the whole line into popularity heading into the 80s. This is the whole thing, like with that idea, like I mentioned, of the deregulation and the doors just opening up for advertising to kids. So a lot of these products that are synonymous and we associate with the 80s, some came out or were introduced more in the 70s, but they had sort of a limited ability to promote them. And that's why you see them bam in the 80s. So there's kind of a crossover in between the decades a bit. So like I said, also in the 80s, this is when those other lesser known monster cereals made their debut, including Fruit Brute, which was discontinued pretty quick in 1982. And then that was replaced by Yummy Mummy. And these were more of a fruity flavored one. The Yummy Mummy obviously had a mummy. Fruit Brute was this like werewolf sort of creation. And that Yummy Mummy replaced, when it replaced Fruit Brute, it was in 87 and it actually lasted all the way to 1992. So I thought I had a good grasp on all these cereals, but I'd never heard of Fruit Brute or Yummy Mummy. So I'm wondering what else I missed there. So the cereals were pretty much, these ones were pretty much discontinued into the 2000s, but in 2010 they started to re-release them around Halloween each year for a couple months. I don't know if you noticed that. I jump all over these things when I see them. In 2013, in August 2013, they decided to release all 5 of the monster cereals, which included Yummy Mummy and Fruit Brute, which had not been on the shelves for more than 25 years. And Target would release some of the original packaging, which was just kind of like a plain white background with the character's face on the front. And I wish I had bought those. I don't know why I thought they'd keep coming out, but there's more of like a modern, arty, cartoony, different version, and I kick myself all the time trying to find those. Okay, next cereal, and probably one of the staple cereals of the 80s, Cap'n Crunch. So not Captain, but Cap'n Crunch. Actually goes all the way back to the 60s, but again, more of a different movement and more of a different approach with how it was advertised to really push it in the 80s. And again, now these commercials could turn into full-on cartoons and they become much more prominent. So this is, I don't know if you know, Cap'n Crunch is based on a recipe that involved putting brown sugar and butter over rice. I'm not making this up. This is a real thing. They found this recipe that had been, I don't know if somewhere in the South, whatever. They just sort of jumped on it and they wanted to kind of create this flavor in cereal form, but it required coming up. They thought this was the perfect combination of flavors, but it required coming up with a new special baking process, and that involved using an oil coating, which was for flavor delivery. I'm using air quotes here, which sort of seems like, I don't know if you remember Christmas Vacation, and Clark would work on the non-nutrient cereal varnish called the Crunch Enhancer. That's kind of the exact thing that was created for Cap'n Crunch. And it did a few things. It kept it from going too soggy. I don't know if you remember eating Cap'n Crunch. It was one of the cereals that would hold up to milk. It wouldn't just like break down. It would hold its crunch. That was kind of their whole focus there. The other thing, the design with that oil coating for flavor delivery was to create a desire to keep eating more of it, which they termed coined the phrase "want moreishness." That's an actual term. And you have to agree, because if you look back, I can't think of too many other cereals that I could eat more of. Like Cap'n Crunch was always at least a 2 to 3 bowl experience. Do you remember that? Even though it tore the living crap out of the roof of your mouth, you had to have at least 2 to 3 bowls of it. So that really worked. Captain Crunch was the mascot of his own cereal, and he was based on an 18th century naval captain. And you know how kids love sea captains. So his actual name is Horatio Magellan Crunch, which is awesome. And he's captain of a ship called the Guppy. So if you're into your nautical themes, you know there's a huge controversy that exists because Captain Crunch wears a uniform that generally only shows 3 stripes, which would technically give him the rank of commander and not captain, which requires 4 stripes. So your childhood has been a complete fraud. Sorry to break it to you here. If you remember back in the commercials, the voice of Captain Crunch, it was done by a guy named Dawes Butler, who did voices for characters like Elroy Jetson, Huckleberry Hound, Snagglepuss, and he was the iconic Yogi Bear. There's been a few other iterations of Captain Crunch that have existed over the years, like Captain Crunch with Crunch Berries, Choco Crunch, Christmas Crunch, Oops, all Crunch Berries, and Captain Crunch Orange Cream Pop Crunch. That's an actual real cereal. And this here, if you've read Ready Player One, which I hope you have because it's epic, you know all about the Captain Crunch whistle. If you don't, this is a toy that came. I don't know if even toys come in cereals anymore. I haven't eaten any of these things in a long time. I'm curious now. Is that still a thing? Kids digging down to the bottom to try and get the toy out? Whatever. So Captain Crunch once included a toy whistle, and it was called the bosun whistle, and it was meant to replicate the whistle used by sailing captains that would signal meal times or commands. Picture like the Von Trapp family and The Sound of Music and the commands like that. So the thing though, these whistles inadvertently played a frequency of 2600 hertz, which is the exact frequency at the time that could be recognized by telephone lines. And there was a former U.S. Air Force electronics technician named John Draper, not Don Draper, John Draper, and somehow he discovered that if you played this recognizable tone into a phone, it could be like a phone box, a phone booth, whatever, wherever, you could make long distance calls for free. It somehow hijacked the signal. And this created a whole underground group of people they called freakers, spelt with a PH. And they would use these mass-produced whistles to stick it to the phone companies. And John Draper and these groups would become actually a pretty big influence on a young Apple co-founder named Steve Wozniak. And he ended up seeking out Draper to learn more about it. And he wanted to just learn how computers, how this could happen, how this could interact. Wozniak actually even tried to prank call the Pope using one. So interesting story. You can learn more about that if you want. But again, use Ready Player or read Ready Player One to see how that's such a huge part of the book. And unfortunately doesn't make it into the movie at all. But there's a few hidden shots of Captain Crunch cereal boxes sort of in homage to it. Okay, the next iconic cereal of the 80s, Mr. T cereal.
Can I have that Mr. T cereal? Okay! I pity the poor fool. Don't eat my cereal.
Okay, I was going to use the commercial, but that's more iconic in the Pee-wee's Big Adventure when he's having breakfast and whips out the Mr. T cereal. And hopefully you remember this one, made by Quaker Oats. Basically a complete Captain Crunch ripoff, if you've had it. Like actually a total ripoff in the shape of teas. That instead of like, you know, Captain Crunch is like those little barrels, Mr. T cereal is just straight up Captain Crunch in tea form. The difference was it contained more iron and B vitamins that they really pushed, as Mr. T was apparently healthy and sort of synonymous with health and wellness, like a good sugary breakfast cereal. The Mr. T cereal first came out in 1984 and would be one of the huge cereal hits of the 1980s and capitalized on the popularity of Mr. T, aka Lawrence Turod, who was obviously huge. Massive mainstream success, starting with the appearance in the Rocky movies and then in the A-Team and everything like that. Mr. T cereal, like Captain Crunch, was pretty much like crack in a bowl, but had one of the highest amounts of sugar ever put into a cereal. And, you know, you remember that, you know, the want more-ishness that Captain Crunch created? This was like sprinkling crack onto that. That's what Mr. T cereal was. And if you remember some of the commercials, some of the catchphrases he would use is like, team up with Mr. T, it's cool. Or, you know, I pity the fool that don't eat my cereal, which Quaker Oats obviously not trying to sell you grammar, but, you know, somehow, I don't know how they snuck it into Pee-wee's Big Adventure, but it worked. Okay, the next one is the fabulous C-3PO's cereal.
Now, it's here. The excitement, the adventure of a new force at breakfast.
We'll call them C-3POs.
New C-3PO cereal from Kellogg's. Twin rings, phased together. For 2 crunches in every double O. A delicious part of this nutritious breakfast. Now you can experience the taste of Kellogg's C-3POs. A crunchy new force at breakfast.
May the force be with you.
Okay, another epic cereal and epic commercial that went along with it. Like I said, these are all on YouTube, but if you go to the show notes today, I have a lot of the commercials put onto the whole article and blog. So again, everything80spodcast.com/7 or a link down below if you're listening on YouTube. So these were made by Kellogg's. This was a kind of a honey sweetened oat and corn cereal that were in the shape of a figure 8. They came out in 1984 and only lasted a couple years, but was very notable for, you probably remember this, having a cutout mask of Luke Skywalker on the back. And these were like, they tasted a bit, I remember them very well. They tasted a bit like Alphabets, if you remember that cereal, kind of the same thing, that oat corn combination with just that honey sweetness thing to it. So C-3PO cereal actually had some interesting timing because Return of the Jedi had already been released and it wrapped up the Star Wars trilogy. That kids thought that was the last they were ever going to see of Star Wars until commercials came out later that year showing C-3PO and his cereal. So it at least gave them some excitement for some new, Star Wars content. Little did they know what was coming. There was some good things if you think about, like, I don't know, the Droids cartoon, or if you think of those made-for-TV movies they did. The prequels are so far ahead that the kids would have no idea. So they're like, I don't know, it's probably a smart idea to introduce this because kids are just going to jump all over it because it's Star Wars content and it's something they can hold and take again and kind of experience. So it was popular that way, and it was just sort of surprising it didn't last longer, but they were just trying to capitalize on the success of the last installment of their franchise. And if you think now, we're getting into the mid-'80s, and now we're getting introduced to toys that hadn't existed before. Star Wars sort of ruled everything, but now we're going to get into Transformers and G.I. Joe and He-Man, and that's going to take over. So it makes sense that it actually only lasted the couple years. Okay, I'm not even going to introduce this next one. You can just listen.
Now, E.T. brings his own favorite cereal to you. New E.T. cereal, made with E.T.'s favorite flavors, chocolate and real peanut butter, shaped like E's and T's. New E.T. cereal. Good. A glowing part of this good breakfast.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is hilarious, and I don't really remember these commercials, but I remember the cereal because this is honestly my favorite cereal of all time, hands down. And E.T.'s obviously a huge hit in 1982. There was some merchandising done, but not as much as like that would come to be. It's funny to think about. It was kind of relatively earlier. It did, like, I had an E.T. lunchbox, I remember. Like, there was definitely still merchandising out there, and then there'd be the whole disaster that was the E.T. Atari game, which I have a whole other episode on, so you can check that out. And the thing, though, is this cereal didn't come out until 2 years after the movie. And it was made by General Mills, and it was a 2-grain crunchy combination of peanut butter and chocolate. I mean, I haven't had this or you probably haven't had it either in, what's this now, like 30 plus years. I can still remember the taste exactly to it. And it was, I don't know, unlike the C-3PO that were in the form of 8s, I never understood what that was for. I think it was sort of like to look like his eyes would or whatever. E.T. cereal was at least made up of little E's and T's. And now I'm wondering if they actually somehow Mr. T ripped off the old T's to recreate theirs, whatever. There's a lot of shadiness in the breakfast cereal game. But the funny thing, as good as the cereal was, it only lasted a year. I mean, and to me, it's another one of those mainstays of the 80s. And if you grew up then, there's no doubt you know the cereal or had it, but it's amazing to think it lasted just 1 year. So I'm glad I got to try it when I did. And again, nothing would, I think, capture the imagination of taste buds everywhere until Reese cereal came out. Something about that peanut butter and chocolate. Phenomenal. Okay, the next cereal. And this one might be a little more unique, but it is Pac-Man cereal.
Go, Solar Pac-Man cereal! Then let's go ghost chomping! Ghost chompers! So tired. Who's gonna help us now?
Me, Super Pac-Man. Now this crispy corn cereal has added new Super Pac-Man marshmallows like me, the biggest ghost chomper of all.
Oh,
Ghost chompers.
I'm a ghost chomper too!
It's Pac-Man. A jumping good part of a nutritious breakfast with me. And me, Super Pac-Man.
Amazing. You can't beat commercials like that from the 80s. So this is a pretty awesome marshmallow-based cereal. It came out in 1983. The arcade game's obviously massive, and of course you need to follow that up in cereal fashion. So it was made by General Mills. Pac-Man cereal was like a crunchy, sweetened corn cereal with the marshmallows added in. The cereal part was basically the round dots that Pac-Man would eat, and the marshmallows were shaped like various Pac-Man characters, like Miss Pac-Man and some of the ghosts, which, if you know your trivia, are named Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and for some reason Clyde. So that's the combination of the ghosts. So this one had kind of a Corn Pops taste, kind of like kicks to it, and similar crunch. And kids in the commercial eating the cereal were considered ghost chompers, so they're trying to brand it that way and identify with the kids. And I don't know if you recognize that voice there at the end of Super Pac-Man. Sounds a lot like Paul Winchell, who did the voice of Gargamel on the Smurfs, and he was also the voice of Tigger. And if you want the most random fun fact of the day, he was one of the guys that co-created the first artificial hearts with Dr. Heimlich. Yes, of the Heimlich maneuver. So don't say I never taught you anything, because that's a great fun fact right there. Okay, next cereal is the bane of my existence, Cookie Crisp. Like I said, we're seeing this commercial on a daily basis, but we can't get it in Canada. And, you know, Cookie Crisp was just the pinnacle to me of all commercially made products, and we couldn't get it. That, or my mom just hid them all at the grocery store so I wouldn't freak the hell out when I saw them. So Cookie Crisp made by General Mills. And this is, I've heard Jerry Seinfeld do this funny bit, but they're not even trying to hide the fact that they're trying to just recreate the taste of chocolate chip cookies in cereal form. You know, parents are doing their due diligence to keep breakfast healthy and whatever, and then they just come out with this that's cookies for cereal. So it came out actually in the late 70s, but then again would become more prominent in the 80s. It would use Cookie Jarvis as the mascot, which was their, again, I don't know if you're, depending when you grew up, and if you had this here and remember, that was the original guy who sold them through the commercials, and he was kind of a Wizard Merlin combination, but his name was Cookie Jarvis. They changed into the familiar, you probably remember more of the Cookie Crook and the Cookie Cop of the 80s, and the commercials were based around Cookie Crook trying to steal the cereal. It was like a live action breakfast table, but then would just have the cartoons superimposed, and Cookie Crook would always be thwarted by the Irish sounding Cookie Cop. Don't know what that was all about, but again, another mainstay of the 80s, and it holds a special yet very frustrating place in my heart. Okay, here's the next cereal, and I'll let the commercial introduce this one. Hopefully you remember it.
Who you waiting for?
Ice Cream Jones.
And new ice cream cone cereal.
My name's Ice Cream Jones. I'm bringing the kids my ice cream cones. A crunchy new cereal for breakfast. The great taste of ice cream cones. Whoa!
I'll have vanilla.
Give me chocolate chip.
They look like little ice cream cones.
And taste like them. The crunchy part of this nutritious breakfast. My name's Ice Cream Jones. With the great taste of ice cream cones. New ice cream cone cereal.
To me, ice cream cone cereal was like they're completely sticking it to parents and mothers. Like, you thought Cookie Crisp was bad. Here's ice cream cones in cereal form. And another example of these companies not giving a crap what they were serving. I feel like it was kind of a dare. Like, there's no way we can put this out, but let's give it a try. And they actually did it. An ice cream cone shaped and flavored cereal. I remember actually getting to try this at someone's house when I was a kid. It came out by General Mills in 1987. And I even remember when I was like going back to all this, I remember thinking this cereal was actually too sweet. And I was like 10 years old at the time. That's your sweet tasting prime enjoyment era, like pinnacle. And yeah, that's the recollection I have of that cereal. So ice cream cone cereal is made with puffs, sweetened to taste like chocolate, vanilla, or a chocolate chip flavor. And then they had sugar cone shaped pieces sweetened to taste just like sugar cone. I don't know if that explains. That's when I started getting my first cavities. It was kind of in the late 80s. But the mascot for, if you remember listening back on this commercial, the mascot for them was good old Ice Cream Jones, who would deliver the cereal on an old-fashioned pedal bike, if you remember the commercial. Probably was a way to have to work off all that sugar. But again, this is a hilarious one and definitely stands out, I think, to me. And that's leading into the next one where I think the cereal companies were just like daring people to try and stop them making this stuff. And this would be S'mores Crunch cereal. And I definitely remember this one. I think we only got it once. And then my mom's like, no way in hell. But I remember it very well. And I loved Golden Grahams. I think that's one of my other favorite cereals of all time. And S'mores Crunch was pretty much a Golden Grahams ripoff, came from 1984. So it was, trying to have a campfire for breakfast. And General Mills was behind it again. They're kind of at the forefront with most of these cereals. And this one was described as marshmallows, chocolate, and graham crackers together in new S'mores Crunch cereal, like a dream come true. And it was. And basically, it's kind of Golden Grahams with a light dusting of chocolate to it. But I do remember these being good, again, because it had a probably higher sugar content than most ones. Okay, next cereal. This one's a little obscure, but this is the Nintendo cereal system. And it's not a console, but it's an actual breakfast cereal. It was made by a pretty unknown company called Ralston Cereals, and it came out in 1989. And the Nintendo cereal system, it combined Mario and Link, which were the two biggest characters going for the NES. And it actually was, the box was comprised of two different parts. So inside the box was two vertical bags that had a different type of cereal. The Mario side contained a fruity flavored combination that had characters like Mario, Bowser, the Koopas, things like that. And then the Link side was more berry flavored. And that cereal was made up of, things like the character shapes of like Link, hearts, keys, boomerangs. But sadly, this cereal didn't make it out of the 80s and was basically discontinued the year it came out, which is very unfortunate. Okay, next, one of the probably most famous cereals of the 80s, and this is Smurf Berry Crunch.
Hey, Smurfs, let's surprise Papa with breakfast in bed. Yeah!
Smurf Berry Crunch is fun to eat. A Smurfy fruity breakfast treat. Made by Smurfs so happily, it tastes like crunchy Smurf berries.
I hate cows.
It's berry shaped and crispy too, very red and Smurfy blue.
Smurf Berry Crunch?
My favorite.
It's our favorite too, Papa Smurf.
Smurf Berry Crunch cereal, a very Smurfy part of this nutritious breakfast.
I forgot all about that yokel Smurf, that like slack-jawed Cletus version of the Smurf. I'm not sure what his name was. But this cereal is made by Post, and it came out in 1983. It was a fruity, sweetened corn, oat, and wheat cereal, and was fortified with the usual extra vitamins that, when you have the manufacturing process and you're taking, whether it's wheat or corn, it's stripped down so much that it basically completely removes any nutrients that were possibly there to begin with in the manufacturing process, and then they add them back in. So kind of a manipulative strategy by food companies when they say, fortified or added in. It's only because they were ripped away in the initial manufacturing process. So don't fall for that. So this was a red and purple cereal that kind of looked like berries. And then it would lead to Magic Smurf Berry cereal in 1987. That contained marshmallows. I think the big takeaway here in this whole episode is you can never go wrong adding marshmallows to something. That's the hot tip of the day. Okay, so we'll start finishing up here. One last one I'll feature is more important if you're Canadian like me, and this is Pro Stars cereal. So if you don't know who Wayne Gretzky is, this won't mean a lot. But if you do and you're remotely familiar with hockey, this is so symbolic of our childhood growing up here. in Canada in the 80s. And we were all enamored with Wayne Gretzky. I don't know if you remember the cartoon show called Pro Stars. In case you don't know who I'm talking about, he was one of the guys featured on that Saturday morning cartoon with Bo Jackson and Michael Jordan. But the serial came out in 1984. And this, of all these ones, this was arguably a healthy cereal. And I'm using that in quotes. And that it's healthy in that it was a whole grain cereal with a touch of honey. And the shape of them were basically stars with a hole in the middle. The cereal would also come with hockey cards, and this would lead to the greatest moment of my young life. So Pro Stars cereal ran a campaign in 1984 where you would send in the box tops, and what a great era that was, where everything you did had to be like mailed in, or you had to collect the flaps or the UPC codes, as opposed to now you just go on the app and enter in whatever. But you had to collect the box tops, and the first prize was to actually meet Wayne Gretzky. But okay, spoiler alert, I didn't win that, but I actually won the third place prize, which was a brand new pair of shoes from a somewhat still unknown company called Nike. So you don't understand the change in the trajectory of a kid's life when they could walk into school with shoes that no one else could get, that were already unique, and that you won specifically from this very popular cereal. So again, the pinnacle moment of my life. They were, and I remember them very well. They're more like a bluish sort of velvet. I don't know if you can picture these. There's more like retro versions of them now. But again, this is like Nike's still almost brand new at this point. But again, amazing. Okay, so finishing up here, here's a few other notable cereals that I just found looking back that I either had forgotten about or was remembered. So here's one, OJ's. Don't know if you remember this. It's an orangey kind of citrus-based cereal similar to Apple Jacks. There was Dunkin' Donuts cereal, so I guess America always ran on Dunkin' in some form. There was Powdered Donuts cereal, spelt with a Z or Z if you're Canadian. And it basically, they took Cheerios and pretty much put a dump truck of sugar on them, if you remember Powdered Donut cereal. There was Nerds cereal, which you may as well just have ate regular Nerds. It was that bad. There was, I remember this one now, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle cereal. And that was kind of like Shreddies, but had marshmallows in it. And then, again, just for random ones I picked up, Bill and Ted's Excellent cereal. And I've got nothing much on that. So I'll finish it here. I didn't think, you probably didn't think I could go this long on 1980s breakfast cereals, but hopefully I've made you remember some of your old favorites or things you've forgotten about or whatever. But basically, we can all agree it was a golden age of cereal. I don't think we'll see anything like that ever again. But I hope you remember all these fondly, because I sure did. So thank you for listening and spending the time here today. Again, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcasts. I should be there. That way I don't have to hand deliver them. It's easier for everybody. If you really like the show, leave it a rating and review. That way more people get to see it. If you're listening on YouTube, you can subscribe there and like it and all that fun stuff. Or you don't have to. I won't be upset at all. Thank you, honestly, just for spending the time here. I know there's a ton of podcasts out there, but I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this one. Okay, that's it for me. See you later. Bye.